Friends and colleagues, welcome to the fifth edition of the webinar series we are hosting. As you know, Habitat Forum and its partners have already completed 4 webinars in June, have lined up 5 webinars more in July, and plan organizing in all 30 by end of September, October this year. All these webinars are multi-subject, multi-theme dialogues, informed and concerned dialogues. And all of them are on one theme, that is rethinking cities, especially rethinking Indian cities. Time has come not only to live in cities, work in cities, grow and prosper in cities, and dream our future in cities, but also to think about cities themselves. And as COVID-19 has shown, and as impending climate change and global warming are telling us, that time has also come to rethink our cities. Cities are no longer asking for investment in money terms only. They're asking for investment in new ideas, new perspectives, alternative ways of doing things, new vision, new creativity, and a new way of bringing economic growth, wealth, prosperity, happiness, and durable peace to our people. And it is not only COVID-19 and climate change that are asking for new ways of doing things. It is the slum dwellers, it is the migrant laborer, it is the polluted rivers, yes, our Ganga Maya, and its depleting water tables, and deteriorating air quality in our cities, which is compelling High Court of City to say that Delhi is a gas chamber. All these are making us think our cities again. And the question to ask is, who does this rethinking? Only the national government, state government, the local government? Do the water boards do this? Slum clearance agencies, planners, professionals, politicians, World Bank? No. Conditions in which our cities are, and conditions in which our cities could be there in 10 or 20 years if things do not change, tell us that politicians and professionals and government thinking about cities is not enough. That ensuring better cities, inclusive cities, sustainable cities, productive cities, caring cities, people's cities is a wider societal responsibility. Not only government must think, not only government must find answers and solutions to problems, we as a society must invest energy, skills, wisdom, and resources we have in finding new solutions and finding new approaches. The 30 webinars on rethinking cities that we are offering is an effort in that direction. It is an effort to take the urban matter to the citizens, to the wider society, to you, to me, to younger generation, to students, to professionals, to the colleges. It is to inform them. It is to make them aware. It is to take the challenge of telling them that 30 more years, 820 million Indians will live in our cities. Your Ahmedabad probably will be twice as much in size. It's also to tell them that fixing our infrastructure in 20 years would require $640 billion, and all we were able to spend under JNNURM in 10 years was only 14 billion. We are grateful to our friends Professor Mathur and Partha Mukhopadhyay who accepted our invitation to host this webinar, and that too on a very thoughtful subject: is city-led economic growth under stress? Our Prime Minister last year had asked us to think about a $5 trillion economy in 5 years. And we thought cities and engines of economic growth will deliver it. Now that OM is asking this question, we are really worried. We are also grateful to the distinguished panel from different parts of the world that is there for this webinar. And we are very thankful for them to make time for this event. We're thankful to Dr. Ramachandran, Dr. Agarwal, Dr. Kala Sitaraman, Dr. Madhu Raghunath, Dr. Lei Lei Song, and Dr. Mark Roberts. Mark, all of them are doctors, and in a COVID time, it is good to fill doctors around. Thank you very much. Om, please take over and manage this webinar.
Shall I start?
Yes.
Okay, Kirti. Thank you, Kirti. Thank you very much, Kirti. Good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I have two jobs to do in the course of the next 10-12 minutes. One is to introduce the theme, and second is to introduce the panel. I take the first one first. Partha and myself have been working within Niti Aayog for the past few months and looking at the urban data very, very closely. There are a couple of things that are very striking. One of the things that has struck us is that there's some kind of a stress in the growth of the urban share of GDP in recent years. The urban share of GDP is rising, but not at the same pace as it used to in the earlier years now. The rate of growth of increase of the share, urban share of GDP, has been slowing down in recent years. Along with this, there is another fact which is also very worrisome, and that part is that the urban share of manufacturing GDP is declining at a very rapid rate. What we are seeing is that at this point in time, the rural share of manufacturing GDP is higher compared to the urban share of manufacturing GDP, which is a very, very strange kind of phenomenon at this moment. Now, we know that something of a similar nature is also happening in many other parts of the world, but any comparison with those countries is uncalled for, for the simple reason being that India is just about 33–34% urban, and while those countries who are experiencing somewhat similar trends have already achieved 50–55% of level of urbanization. So it's a source of worry here, and we thought we will look into it a little more closely. Then comes COVID-19. What it has done is known to everyone, but there are a couple of things that I thought I state them very clearly. One is that it has severely dented the urban economy in our country, very, very severely dented, and in two particular ways. One is that the self-employment component of the urban informal sector has been completely decimated. There's no sign of the self-employed component of the urban informal sector. Second is the urban informal sector has been seriously affected by COVID-19. Apart from MSME, which certainly has closed down because of the flight of labor from these cities. The flight of labor, the migration on a very, very massive scale, people say it is about 40 million people who have migrated out of just 17, 18, 19 megacities is it's again a very strange phenomenon that we have noticed, and it is doing two things to the Indian economy. One, that it has distorted the labor market in the sense that labor is not available in cities where it is needed, and labor is surplus where it is not needed. This kind of distortion, and it is this kind of a distortion that would considerably delay the economic revival that we are aiming at this point in time. But these facts are known. What, however, is the interpretation of this fact, which is causing us worry, and that really is a trigger for this webinar. And the interpretation, one of the interpretation of these trends is that there is something wrong with the large cities. Large cities have become far too big, and we need to curb their growth because 80% of the cases, 80% of the COVID-led cases are located in those markets. And something is wrong there. The size has become much too large. Many have come forward with the thesis that the diseconomies of scale have set in, and we need to correct the balance between large, small, and medium-sized cities. And one of the questions that Partha will explain it more fully is simply this, that the factors such as density, such as agglomeration, which are characteristics of large cities, and which also lead to economic growth, are precisely those that also lead to the spread of this virus. And it is a link between growth, economic growth, density, agglomeration, and the virus, which is making issues extremely complicated. And it is this trigger that led Partha and myself to think that we need to discuss it with a very distinguished panel that we have today. We should throw open these questions to them and see what is their assessment, how they view this phenomenon that is affecting us and possibly some other countries as well. And that is why we thought we'd spend 2 hours discussing this amongst 8 of us. That's the background of the webinar. Now let me come to the introduction. The only person whom I had not met in the 6-member panel, which is a very distinguished panel, is Madhu Raghunath so far. I'm seeing her for the first time on the screen right now. Madhu is with the World Bank, the Manila office of the World Bank right now. She is looking after 4 countries, as I see, which are Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, and one more country, and she can mention that in her when she comes on the screen. She is a city planner from MIT, and there is, I see the connection between both Madhu, O.P. Agarwal, also from the MIT, and I also spent some time with MIT long time ago. So Madhu will bring, and she was also a specialist on the Vietnamese affairs, having worked there for some years. So, and she will certainly share with us what she thinks of these questions. Then Dr. Ramachandran, former secretary, if I recall right, he took over as secretary November of 2006 when NURM just about 1 year old. And he's the one who took the initiative of really taking it, putting it on the ground, taking up all the challenges that a program as big as the NURM with a very different character compared to the most other urban programs that India has had by then. He really led the program extremely well in the course of the next 3-4 years when he was secretary. Now we used to have small run-ins with Dr. Ramachandran in those years, but that certainly has not prevented us from meeting as often as we can, except that we meet more often in the evenings rather than during the course of the day. That's Dr. Ramachandran. O.P. Agarwal also falls in the same category, a very distinguished bureaucrat. He was also in the ministry about the same time when JNNURM began, and I got to know him at that point. And since then, he has changed quite a bit. His career has become much more diversified after he left the Government of India. I guess 3-4 years after I met him, he joined one of the very large private consulting firms, moved on to the World Bank, and is one of the finest mobility and transport system man right now in the country and possibly around the world as well. That's open. Mark is an amazing individual. Mark Roberts. He worked on India quite a bit, and he knows India as much as any of us do. Now, I remember his report that he brought out in 2015 on leveraging urbanization in South Asia. And when we put the question to him that how do you see India's urbanization, and his reply was, India's urbanization is messy, and India's urbanization is hidden. And that made him very, very different from the kind of interpretation that we used to have from all other experts. And I guess you will hear more about it from Mark when he comes on the screen. Then we have Lei Lei Song, currently with the Asian Development Bank, the India office, but he looks after South Asia. He earned his PhD. He's more than a very large his Australian influence. He spent long years there studying for his PhD, his master's in philosophy, and in very interesting subjects. And one of the special jobs that he had was that he was senior advisor to the president of the Asian Development Bank, and he knows the nitty-gritty of how the Asian Development Bank functions. We, Partha and myself, have the opportunity of interacting with him during our days with the NITI Aayog just about a few months back, he and his colleagues, and those were very insightful comments from him. And last is Kala Sridhar. Kala and myself have been colleagues for almost a decade at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. We have authored a book together at the NIPFP. We have continued to work subsequently as well on an India-China joint project. And I think it would be interesting for all of you to know that the last research meeting that both of us attended was in Wuhan a couple of years ago, from where all this virus really began. We spent good time in Wuhan with our Chinese colleagues and with our other Indian colleagues. And that meeting was very special because we were finalizing our papers for a book, which is just coming. And the book is Cities of Dragons and the Elephants. It had just come out, Kala and myself and several others, but 20 of us worked on this one. And that was a very, very interesting exercise. Kala right now has a Fulbright at the University of California, Berkeley, and is a professor at ISEC in Bangalore. Now that completes the introduction, Partha. You take over from here, and I don't promise that I'll keep quiet for the next 2 hours. I'll come in as and when I feel that I should. And Partha, please allow me to that kind of a flexibility, if not for anything else, just for my age. Thank you all very much. Thank you all very much. Over to you, Partha.
Thank you, Om, and thank you, Kirti, and welcome everyone to this webinar on our cities under stress. What we'll do during the course of this webinar is hope to have a conversation among the 6 invited panelists and Professor Mathur. I will try and keep as quiet as possible over the next 2 hours. To begin with, let me, the way the structure would work would be for the first half an hour or so, we would discuss the question largely related to the viability of the city as an entity, not just Indian cities, but cities across the world, since we have the pleasure of the presence of very distinguished panelists with wide international experience. And then we'll move to discussing the issues around urban schemes in India and the question of federal support for Indian cities. And then open up for the audience. I can already see that some of you are already asking questions. And what we will try and do as moderators of the discussions will be try and collate these questions and bring them to the panelists. But of course, if people would like to ask individual questions, I think there'll be sufficient time for that after the first two sessions that we spoke about. So let me begin this by asking Madhu as to the question that Professor Mathur raised, which is the way we think about cities, the reason that it produces innovation, the reason it produces growth is largely because of lots of serendipitous interactions between people, which then give lives to new ideas, and those ideas then generate growth and income. The fact of this particular pandemic makes, as we can see in this workshop, something that is, makes that particular, especially serendipitous interaction, not possible at this point in time. People would not want to meet anybody else they don't know at this structure, etc. So is this just a temporary phenomenon? Is this a 2-year, let us say, hiatus in the role of the city, while the pandemic sort of plays itself out and eventually it becomes something that we live with, and then we just go back to business as usual? Or is this something that is going to fundamentally change the nature of the city, as some people are now talking about? All of you must be having conversation about this, speaking to other people. What are those conversations about? Are people really concerned about the fundamental viability of the city as an entity? More fundamentally, are you concerned about the city as an entity? Madhu.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Mukhopadhyay. Also, thank you, Dr. Shah and Dr. Mathur, for your warm welcome. It's a pleasure to join this distinguished panel, and I hope I can add value through my experience at the bank. Just to start out by saying that, to me, as an urban planner, I think this question that you asked is super relevant, but also for me, it's also very important to emphasize that the cities are here to stay. So there's no question that cities are going to be quite important and they're going to be part of our lives, because this is where people connect, innovation happens, and of course, this is where most of the economic activities also start out. But I think what this pandemic has basically helped us realize, and this morning I was with a top policymaker in Philippines, he made a very interesting remark by saying, we have to learn how to live with the pandemic. So to answer your first question, the pandemic is here to stay. So the question is, how do we then live with what is happening today in most of our cities? What I have observed, at least from the countries that I worked previously, especially in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam and China, is that I think the short-term public health becomes a key priority. What is really critical is for cities to start investing in testing, contact tracing, but also upgrading their public health facilities. Because if they don't get their public health systems in place, there is no way that the cities will come out of this pandemic. We saw this in Vietnam. They had experience from SARS. So the minute they got wind of this pandemic, they saw the first case, they immediately mobilized their epidemiological committee. And what they did was they brought in a concerted public effort into place to really start addressing and tracing the problem of COVID-19. And what was really impressive that I learned from Vietnam was that, and I just left the country a year ago, was that they had only 350 cases. And that came in precisely because the institutions and the leadership in Vietnam recognized the problem early on, took very quick action, and were really able to move rapidly to address the problem. So that to me is very key. If we don't get our public health facilities and our public health system in place, it's going to be very hard for us to then live and learn through the pandemic. The other trend that we're also observing, and I see this a lot in Philippines, is that everyone's starting to rethink urban planning. And this is becoming increasingly important, where there's a huge emphasis coming in on social equity. Because as you know, COVID does not differentiate between rich and poor, it affects all. So what we're starting to hear from a lot of policymakers is, how can we start looking at place-based policies which are much more equitable? And this is something that we can learn from a few countries that have done it right. And these are, again, mostly middle-income countries that have done very well in terms of provision of public services, where they have placed a huge emphasis on public equity, where the government has went in and really invested a lot in what we call as informal neighborhoods. If these neighborhoods have good access to services, water supply, sanitation, and other facilities, we see that it's easier to address issues from an urban planning perspective. The other area that we're also hearing is how to make cities livable. This is something that Mr. Shah brought out in his opening remark. What is really interesting is that home-based work has actually brought in some good benefits for our environment. One observable phenomenon that we see is that we see blue skies in a lot of cities. And this is because congestion has rapidly gone down. But what's also happened is that where cities don't have public transport, like a robust public transport like we see in Manila, there is more emphasis on non-motorized transport. So you're suddenly seeing bicycle lanes being like pop-up bicycle lane infrastructure that are coming up, because that's the only way that people can get from their home to work. So it's very interesting. We're seeing a little bit of a rethink in terms of cities, where earlier our cities were dominated by cars, now they're being dominated by bicycles. And for all this to happen, for me, what I really see is quite important is going to be leadership and institutions. I saw this in Vietnam. If leaders invested more in their cities, in their neighborhoods, they saw this as a path to their progression within the party structure. And again, this is something that I take away as a big lesson is, if we have really strong leadership who pays attention to social equity, that's something that can really help rethink our cities. But to come back to your first question, are cities still economically viable? I still think so. I think it's just that this pandemic is teaching us to start looking at things differently and to start reshaping things which are more going to be important for people and for cities on the whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Madhu. Let me now turn to Dr. Ramachandran and ask him the same question, which is, are the conversations with his colleagues and friends leading to the same conclusions that Madhu outlined, which is basically at this point in time, there isn't a fundamental challenge to the viability of the city, but there are certain aspects that need to be invested in. One of them is public health, the other is social equity, and then, of course, the whole structure of how you think about urban planning in a city, where it may be less about the kinds of mobility and car-based cities that we have seen. Is that the kind of conversations that you have been having with your friends and colleagues?
Thank you, and greetings to all participants. I'll present my approach in two forms. The first part is from the Indian experience. I want to look at how at least our key cities behaved. The failure to provide houses to those who need houses in the cities despite having programs starting with the Rajiv Awas Yojana and things like that. Utter failure to care for migrant workers. States really failed to help them when they really needed help. And I think that has upset the balance. One really has to see how many of them would want to come back to big cities to work. Employers did not take adequate care of these people. They more or less deserted them. There have been food distribution which has happened in cities like Surat, but it was a fundamental question of the migrant workers wanting to go back, which was not facilitated, for which the state should have really taken the initiative to prevail over the center to get the trains running. So I think taking into account what is happening in a big city like Mumbai, the entire scenario is worth studying as far as Mumbai is concerned. What went wrong where? The Dharavi issue, the migrants issue, and probably a broader failure of urban planning, so to say. And also, I think there has been a pathetic failure of the elected urban bodies in some of these, or most of these cities. There is a general tendency to blame the bureaucracy, but more than that, what happened to the elected system, that's also something important. And of course, the inadequate investment which has been happening in the health systems has really come out, and that would naturally be an area of focus, provided funds or resources are available. Failure of megacities, that is a matter of big concern as far as I can see as a lesson from this. And there is a need to look at their governance system. There is also another requirement under the Disaster Management Act for every city to have what is called a city disaster management response system. How effective was this? And if it was there, why did it not work to a considerable extent? What went wrong? And shouldn't there have been enough preparedness for a situation like this? At least till things more or less got stabilized as far as handling is concerned. We can't have zero growth cities, so how do we take care of this requirement? So coming to the first part of the discussion, I too would think the relevance of cities would continue, but it would be in a slightly different form. And as we all keep seeing, there are already signs of some change which are going to happen, like working from home probably will become a little bit more regular, probably some impact on the mobility problems which we have, more online conferences, more webinars, board meetings taking place over the VC and things like that. There was a real scare that the corner shops, the retail will more or less disappear. It looks like that way they came in handy for most of us in the local areas. They are bound to continue as I see it. So that will be a different role. And probably in the planning process, this has really got to be built into the scheme of things, providing for local shops which meet the local requirements. Probably there is going to be some reduction as far as use of more office space is concerned. The demand could slightly come down. Online classes as far as education is concerned seems it will become more relevant. There will be need for more technological equipment and technological investment. I think many of us, including myself, have learned more how to make use of the mobile which we have or the laptop which we have rather than go physically visit a place. So more digital use and less of activity for the banks. I think parks, open spaces, and all this will gain more and more importance because one has understood the relevance of these. Community level, probably better interaction should be possible. And subsequently, when I have to, I'll also refer to the areas of our system which we had thought of, which we sort of ignored. The polling booth level, that is at about 1,000 voters level, there should be something called an area or a unit. Whether it is elected or not, I think in the scheme of things, even if it's not elected, if we had an information system at that level, then probably managing this pandemic would have been much better, especially taking care of those who require assistance, the senior citizens, the differently able people and things like that. And I would also very, very strongly support this argument that if, depending upon our resource scenario, we'll have to have a second look at how the health system is spread all over the city and how it can be changed or made more effective. So very broadly, to comment on this first part, vocal for local. I think that can be taken to the area of local governance. If local governments can be strengthened a little bit more, I don't envisage an empowered system coming into existence in the given scheme of things. But if they can be empowered more and there could be more control or management of activities at the city level, that would make a big difference. So we need to have a relook at the governance system, more so for the mega cities. And I think that has to be an important feature of our scheme of things, as we have learned from lessons from whatever has happened in the big cities of the country, whether it is Mumbai, Hyderabad, or New Delhi. We have to have governance systems which can handle all types of situations. As I said, area should become more relevant in the scheme of things. And some more action in the direction of calculating the city GDP so that we get an idea as to what comes from where and who contributes, who is relevant in the scheme of things, and what needs to be done. I think that will also will have some more importance in the scheme of things. So I would like to stop at that. These are, some lessons and the direction we need to take, and some of the changes which will have to come about, whether they'll come about or not, that is for us to see in the future. Thank you. Over to you. Back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Ramachandran. The issue of managing cities locally is, of course, a primary one. And one of the most interesting challenges and contradiction that has been thrown out has largely been in the case of Mumbai, because it has had a rough experience with the pandemic. Its cases are now more than that of all of China. But it has also been, at least in the last couple of months, perhaps the most transparent in disclosing information about what is happening in the city. And as its experience with Dharavi showed, the importance of having local government officials that people trusted in the ability to actually prevent the spread any further once the epidemic entered that dense settlement that Dharavi is. So there are both positives and, of course, very visible negatives that is coming out of Mumbai, and which is perhaps the most capacitated city among all our cities across India, so to speak. And that is an important aspect that we need to think about when we look at governance going further. Let me now pose the same question to Dr. Song about the conversations that in his organization and with his friends in Chinese cities, for instance, with which he has had a fair degree of experience, about the nature of changes that are being planned in cities going forward. Madhu spoke about the return to the bicycle city. It is a phenomenon about which people in Beijing would be very familiar, even as late as the 1990s. Lei Lei, what have your conversations been like about the basic viability of the cities? Do you agree with the propositions that are being advanced by Madhu and Dr. Ramachandran that there is no threat as yet to the basic viability of the city as an entity, but we do need to make some modifications to the manner in which the city is governed?
Thank you very much, Partha. And first, let me thank the organizer to invite me to this webinar. And I'm honored to join this group of prestigious speakers to discuss a very important topic. I think I'm roughly in the same agreement with the previous two speakers. So city definitely would still continue to be the engine of economic growth, but for the moment, city-led economic growth is under stress. Because the pandemic recession and the cities generate economic growth and jobs because most of economic activities are being conducted in cities. and the lockdowns stall economic activities and therefore growth and jobs. And to protect the lives, economic activities were stopped. Then the economy is in the free fall. And we probably would see a huge contraction in the Indian economy in the previous quarter. And this quarter, probably we will see some pickup, but still in a bigger contraction. And for the whole fiscal year, we will see a huge contraction. So in my conversation, I think the most discussion is still about the survival, because the spreading of the pandemic in India is continuing. And yesterday we saw the largest increase. And unfortunately, India now has got the third largest number of COVID-19 in the world. So probably still in the early stage, there are still a lot of uncertainties how this pandemic would evolve. And we never know. There's a very low probabilities and the pandemic might become more severe if the virus mutates. And then probably we go back to the darker days, and then the cities, human being might need to abandon cities to go to the rural area, to go to the vast space. So there's still some uncertainties. But as I said at the beginning, I believe city-led economic growth would still be the model, and we need some justifications depending on how this pandemic would evolve and whether we would get effective vaccines and treatments. And then what modifications we need to think about? I think the previous speakers have already mentioned many, but here I would like to emphasize three. One is Dr. Ramachandran actually mentioned this. I think the model of favoring megacity development might be challenged. I believe a lot of countries actually, they favor megacity development because you have a huge agglomeration effects from megacities, and they can share the resources, they can learn a lot of new technology, and they can boost the productivities. And in India, you have 6 megacities. They are expanding in the past 20, 30 years. And this is also true in China and in other parts of the world. So megacities are the magnetic center of economic life. And because they have the resources, they provide the opportunities, then people congregate to megacities. But this pandemic actually shows the weaknesses and the vulnerabilities of megacities. So this is why probably post-pandemic, I believe we need to pay much more attention to smaller sized cities, medium sized cities, and probably they would offer a better chance for the resilience and the robustness of city life and city economies. So this is the first point. Second is many issues we have neglected in urbanization, such as the issues of the investment in public health, investment in healthcare facilities, affordable housing and low-cost housings. All these issues in this pandemic have aggravated the spreading of the pandemic, makes things much severe adverse impact on people's life and the livelihoods. You, Dr. Ramachandran, have already mentioned the issues in Mumbai. Yeah, so I don't want to repeat here. So, but the third point, I would like to reiterate what Dr. Ramachandran has mentioned. This, he calls it local for local. I'm a very strong believer this decentralization is the better way to address many, many issues. And the megacity issues, and then the issues we encountered in these pandemics, we probably need to think really hard about the local governance, strengthening local governance, and then we have to match local governments with adequate revenue expenditure for them to conduct their responsibilities. And this is cities, so it needs to have adequate resources to build critical social and fiscal infrastructure. And India, probably this issue is more acute. Although India is a federal state, but somehow decentralization, fiscal federalism in India is not as robust as in other countries, even in the early days, comparing to the early days of China. In the first 20 years of the Chinese reform in the 80s and 90s. Actually, China was much more decentralized, and the local governments have had a very big say in its local economic governance. And this local for local, it's truly implemented in China. And in India, we're already seeing the differences. You look at if the local governance is very robust and strong, such as in a slum area in Mumbai, then you could have a very good handle of the pandemics. Then it's possible to contain the spreading of the pandemic in the slum area. So this local for local or governance, strengthening local government, and the role of local governments in economic development, I think India needs to really think hard post the pandemic. So I just stop here. Over to you, Partha. Partha, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Thank you so much. I'm beginning to see we are way too much in agreement, and I'm hoping that OP and Mark and Kala will push us in a different direction. But the core issue, and let me turn to you now, OP, is, and there are already issues that are coming up in the structure, is the kind of changes that are being talked about. Is that kind of change possible while retaining the basic character of the city? Or are these kinds of changes that are being talked about essentially going to affect the character of the city and its ability to produce these kinds of growth-inducing innovations and interactions going forward? Is it, if we take away the subway from New York, if we take away the suburban trains from Mumbai, do Mumbai and New York still continue to be the kind of engines that they are at this point in time? All yours.
Thanks, Partha. Thanks, Om, and thanks, Kirti, for inviting me to this. It's lovely to see a lot of old friends, including Madhu over here. But pleasure to be in this discussion, fascinating discussion so far. As you said, let me try to push it in a slightly different direction. I don't think it's possible to disagree with what has been said. I think I'm completely in agreement with whatever has been said. But let me add a slightly different dimension to it. You know, I don't think there is any getting away from urbanization as a requirement for growth. I mean, there is no getting away from the benefits of agglomeration economies of scale. I mean, these are paradigms which will stay. But there are a number of questions that come up, particularly around two dimensions. One is, what is the level of good density for urban areas? We keep talking about compact cities, but what is the level of compactness that we are looking for? We've not really put any upper or lower bounds to it in the discussion so far, number one. Number two, what do we mean by growth? Let me address these 2 points. See, as far as densities are concerned, I think when a lower bound to my mind will be, what is the level at which you start securing those agglomeration economies that we are looking for? And I think those agglomeration economies are at different levels for different kinds of services. So maybe for an airport, you need an agglomeration economy, which is, you know, many more people in the captive area than you would need for, say, a bus system or for some other kind of system. So every level of service has a different agglomeration economy, and that's what we need to start thinking about. So that much we should have. The second is the other side of the boundary. You know, recently there was some order, I think, of the Supreme Court or the Green Tribunal, I don't recall which, but which asked a very fundamental question, is what is the carrying capacity of a city? we've all talked about compact cities, we've all talked about densities, but where are we recognizing the carrying capacity of a city? Is Dharavi part of that carrying capacity, or is it way beyond the carrying capacity? You know, as a transport person, we talk about congestion as the carrying capacity of a road. Similarly, is there a carrying capacity of a city that we merely need to research and think about and come up with some kinds of bounds? Now, Mumbai and Delhi have almost similar populations, but Delhi is over about 1,600 square kilometers and Mumbai is about 700 square kilometers. Are these the kind of densities that we're looking at? And the UN's population projections are talking about Delhi getting to 38 million. Will that 38 million be within this, 1,600 square kilometers? Or what are we going to get? I think that is one thing that we need to start researching, talking about, and implementing into our planning process. Are what are the lower and upper bounds of this, density that we talk about? I'll come to what are possible actions a little later. But even when you talk about densities, the argument I would make is, the World Bank's Reshaping Economic Geography talks about economic geography where the denominator is the area. Can we change that denominator? Can it be a denominator which says something like access time and access cost? So looking at mobility, what kind of mobility systems allow you to access a place that you need to get to within a certain time and within a certain cost? Can we think of something like that in looking at economic density? The second is, what is growth? Now, is it just the monetary value of the goods and services produced in a city or a country? That GDP, is that the only metric we should be using for growth? Are there other metrics that need to start coming in? There have been talk about human happiness and a number of other social indicators which come into this whole element of growth. Can that sort of start coming in? I would say these are two dimensions that we need to start thinking about. To my mind, my own vision would be that a city which is not necessarily a Delhi or a Mumbai, but a cluster of cities, a region which has a cluster of smaller cities, maybe with one bigger city and a whole bunch of smaller cities, but connected together very well. To my mind, that is the kind of geographical spread that we should be looking at in thinking of what future cities will look like. And that is where the kind of densities that have led to, greater spread of this coronavirus and maybe future problems of this nature that will come up will take place. And in that kind of urban shape, you will see much more manageable sizes that we will see in future. Otherwise, I can't imagine Delhi being managed as one city with 38 million people. I can't imagine. Let me stop with that.
Arthur, can I come in for a second?
Please, sir.
Yeah. Opi, how would you place Tokyo and several other cities of Japan in relation to density, which is extremely high, and they manage them extremely well? I do not think that Japan has ever considered the lower bound of the amount. They're constrained by other factors. The densities, they are much higher compared to any other country. Look at Hong Kong. I mean, which city will really beat Hong Kong in terms of density? And they function extremely well. This is one point. The second point. The second point, once again, I mean, you're talking about a cluster of cities, and that is precisely how Delhi was planned in 1960. There were 6 ring tiles around Delhi, and Delhi would really become a small. The regional component was inbuilt into the first master plan. The growth, just the way it has happened, is completely in contravention of how it has been planned. Just 2 points. I thought I'll intervene at this point before I go. Thank you.
You want me to respond, or can I come back on this later?
As you wish. What would you like to do?
No, very quickly, I think Hong Kong, the kind of management that you see in Hong Kong is the kind of management we want to see here. That's one. The second about Delhi, the way it was thought of, You see, you can have that spread, but if you don't have good connectivity between them, I think that spread is pointless. Today, I can't get a bus from Gurgaon to Delhi. I can get a metro from Gurgaon to Delhi, but I can't get a bus from Gurgaon to Delhi. Is that connectivity?
So this is one topic of conversation that it's also cropping up in the Q&A. So I think we'll be discussing this going forward. And I sort of see the Tokyo-Osaka corridor as one run by essentially these high-speed trains is one possible illustration of what OP is talking about. Clusters of cities along a particular corridor with high degree of mobility. But the previous two speakers, Mark, Lei Lei and OP, have both spoken about essentially decentering or demetropolizing the urban form and thinking about other kinds of cities. And they can still be pretty large. They could be 500,000, they could be 1 million. I mean, there are very few cities above 1 million in Europe, for instance. Your own reports that Professor Mathur referred to, the messy part got a lot of press, but there was also the hidden part. And the question is the kind of urbanization that then we are thinking about a more organic, based on connected, not necessarily small cities, but smaller cities that sort of are going to evolve into a viable network? Is that something that countries of the size of India, which can afford to have a large number of smaller cities, is that going to be our way of urbanization going forward in a more resilient way in some sense, so that even if things like these happen to one or two of those cities, it will still have the ability for the economy to sort of recover, because the other cities would still sort of carry on? Is that a possibility? But but again, what are your conversations saying? I was hoping that a lot of you would tell me what your friends and colleagues are telling you about. So if you have insights from that, I would love to hear that as you speak. Thank you. All yours.
Thank you very much, Partha. Thank you as well for the invitation. It's such a privilege to be part of this event. So maybe before I get to the questions kind of posed by Partha and the discussion kind of reacting, I must say I do agree with most things that the panelists have also said. I mean, I sort of just to go back to this question about the basic viability of the city. I just wanted to maybe bring a bit of a different dimension. I mean, I think we sort of forgotten, but it's kind of important to remember that looking back in economic history, cities have spent, much of that history grappling with problems of outbreaks of diseases and the human suffering that goes along with that. I mean, this was the case in kind of the major Western European cities from 1350, for example, up until the early 18th century. The plague regularly slaughtered large numbers of people in those cities. And then in the early 19th century, we have problems like yellow fever and cholera. And because of the risk of disease in major cities, for example, in 1901, it was still the case that life expectancy at birth in New York was 7 years lower than in the rest of the United States. And that's kind of the opposite of what we see today. We now see better health outcomes in general within cities than in rural areas, but it used to be the opposite. And so I think this kind of goes back to this question about the resilience of cities. I think looking at the long sweep of history, cities have proved to be incredibly resilient. And so I'm confident that cities will again prove to be resilient. There have been bigger shocks than COVID-19 in the past that cities have managed to survive and sort of prosper eventually. But some of that kind of prospering has necessitated innovation, almost kind of self-protecting urban innovation to deal with the problems of kind of diseases. And like historically, we've seen things like wider streets being introduced and the such like. So, I mean, turning out a bit more to the conversations with colleagues, then again, sort of linking to this kind of point about economic history, I think, you know, we have basically forgotten about this kind of congestion force associated with cities. You know, greater proximity, okay, it becomes easier to exchange your idea, but it also becomes easier to pass on a disease through a cough or through some other means. And so I think for cities to bounce back and kind of more generally the urban system to bounce back, we need to, you know, think through how better to manage this kind of newly remembered congestion force. And that's alongside of the other negative congestion forces associated with urban density. And those congestion forces include the pressure of urban populations on infrastructure, basic public services, land, housing, the environment. And Professor Mathur at the beginning was kind enough to reference the report we wrote a few years ago and this idea of messy urbanization. And kind of messy urbanization is the outcome of the failure to adequately deal with these negative congestion forces. And we've seen this kind of messiness, as well as the kind of hidden urbanization to some extent. That's also a consequence of this messiness. Has sort of exacerbated the risks associated with COVID-19. And so, I mean, in that context, you know, I don't think it's so much a need as kind of rethinking cities as a need for really re-emphasizing the importance of addressing these very basic problems. And I sort of agree with all the panelists, you know, it's kind of wrong to be thinking about population density necessarily, or thinking about, you know, city size necessarily. I think, you know, we need to think more about kind of economic density, and what you want to promote is kind of healthy economic density. Further, you need to think a lot about the economic geography of both individual cities, people being able to be connected to economic opportunities, access to basic services, and be able to have affordable housing through the management of density in kind of clever ways, as well as connectivity between different places. I guess one other thing I would like to kind of throw into the mix, maybe, again, this kind of relates to accessibility and kind of connectivity in some ways, is, you know, just the importance of public spaces. I think COVID-19 has sort of really brought home more than ever the importance of public spaces, the importance of things like sidewalks and parks and open spaces, and, you know, given the potential that they provide for social distancing in outdoor settings. And so let me leave it there for now and kind of pass back.
Thank you, Mark. Let me finally turn to Kala and ask her, you have done a lot of work on the economy of Indian cities. So from that perspective, do you see this basic episode as a blip that, as Mark just mentioned, cities have lived through these kinds of epidemics from time to time? Surat had its episode with the plague. This is something that is much more widespread, but even though it is widespread, it might still be short-lived. So 2 years from now, we more or less could be going along in the same direction that we were going along last December. Is that how you see the issue, or do we need to change direction?
Okay. Thank you, Partha. Everybody, can you confirm that you're able to hear me clearly?
Absolutely.
Okay. First of all, let me take this opportunity to thank Partha and Mathur for inviting me to be part of this distinguished panel, and it's very timely, thoughtful, and relevant seminar or webinar as we call it now. What I want to say is similar to what the other panelists have said, but I'll be a bit provocative, and I think Partha wanted that kind of provocation here. He did not want us all to necessarily agree. So what I will start with is the situation of our urbanization and cities pre-COVID. So pre-COVID, I mean, you know that around the world, our ADB World Bank colleagues are here. Very few countries of the world have reached a per capita income of $10,000 without at least reaching 60% urbanization, 60%. And India is at 31%, maybe now it's at 35%, but in some of my work, I find that, I mean, India is still very, very conservative as far as the definition of how urban areas are defined. So if we were to be a little bit more liberal, we would be nearly about 50–60% urban, even as of 2011, based on that data. So extrapolating this empirical evidence just like that I quoted, India's per capita income must have been $10,000. Clearly it is not. Clearly we are at only about $2,000, $2,500 of per capita income now. So why is this the case? So this is the pre-COVID, right? Pre-COVID. So pre-COVID, Partha asked us to narrate here what our conversations, informal conversations with our colleagues and friends told us about this, right? So before COVID, in cities like Bangalore, I mean, Bangalore, as all of you know, as Manila, Madhu, you talked about Manila. Manila and Bangalore are very similar in terms of their massive traffic gridlocks, right? I've been to the ADB several times, and each time I really take about 2 hours to make it to ADB Avenue, right? Discovery Suites. So what I want to say is that Bangalore, I don't know about this duration of commute kind of evidence from Manila, but Bangalore, I can speak for it. 1991, the one-way time to work in Bangalore was 25 minutes average, right? In 2001, this increased to about 40 minutes one way, 2001, okay? So 2017, this became about 48 minutes as per some study we did in Bangalore, okay? So what does this mean for the city economy? The city economy is largely defined by its effective labor market. Effective labor market refers to the number of jobs accessible within a certain commute, right? So if the commute time in Bangalore or in Manila increased from 25 minutes all the way to 49, 50 minutes to an hour, that means the effective labor market of that particular city decreased. And I think there can be no doubt, there is no doubt that a city's economy, its productivity, its efficiency, everything depends on the effectiveness of the jobs. And that is crucially determined by the area of the city's effective labor market, which actually was constantly declining in most Indian cities, as Dr. OP also would probably confirm. He is a transport economist. So now post-COVID, what is the story? What has happened? I've talked Partha with many of my friends and colleagues. I myself have traveled a few times. I've not been outside of home too much for past 3 months as most of you, but the travel time has significantly declined, right? I can make it from Sarjapur Road, which is the southeastern end of Bangalore, to Nagarbavi, which is the southwestern end of Bangalore, just like zip zap zoom in 45–50 minutes, right? That is like a wow kind of effect. So this certainly means that the work from home and the pandemic and all these health crises have suddenly enlarged the size of the city's effective labor market. And I think OP Agarwal referred to this kind of in his discussion about population density and cities. But I want to talk about this in the context of the vehicle capacity ratio of India's roads. In our own Bangalore, I mean, I think on some important arteries of the city, the vehicles are about 3 times more than the capacity of the roads. So this is pre-COVID again. So post-COVID, we would expect that to significantly decline. And I basically look at this COVID, the pandemic, the crisis as nature's way of balancing the needs of the environment and also the city's economic output. And I hear many CEOs say that they are much more productive working from home than they would otherwise. Otherwise, they would spend a lot of time commuting, during which time they used to make phone calls. And I used to commute about 2 hours to my office every day. But that used to result in a more than optimal amount of reading, right? So that is the story. So now post-COVID, how should cities manage? To answer Partho's question, whether cities continue to be viable? Certainly, yes. Certainly, yes. So as I see it, first and foremost lesson, I should say, that cities should manage their municipal markets well, right? Municipal vegetable, fruit markets, live markets, wet markets, everything should be managed well, right? That is the first lesson from this crisis, so to say. I think the second lesson is that cities, I think, should encourage work from home to the extent possible. Although people generate a lot of economic activity when they pick up a coffee on their way to work, they sit in office, go grab a bite of lunch, and then while coming back, meet some friends and meet them for tea or coffee, right? So all this economic activity is missed, but cities, I think, benefit a lot from working from home, encouraging their, at least the density part, right? So that way, even the sharing, matching, learning, agglomeration, all those things continue to happen. So I think until the COVID crisis happened, rural areas, development professionals spent all their time, money and effort researching rural poverty, rural development, and so forth. But I would say that this COVID crisis is the revenge of the city. So the city has come back. Now I can see this word city and urban all over, because now, you know, when Mumbai is locked down, when Chennai is locked down, when Delhi is locked down, now when Bangalore is locked down, how important cities are. I think this is really the revenge of the city. And I hope that we can demonstrate to the policymakers and the world that our cities are very, very important, and then they continue to be more important in the times to come. Thank you. I would like to stop at this point and take any questions if anybody has.
Thank you, Kala. I hope that you'll have many questions, first from your panelists and from others, but I hear you raise two kinds of issues, and I think that'd be useful for other persons on the panel to pitch into that conversation. One, as you said in closing, it may well be that work from home actually will lead to greater density, because in some sense, what I hear you saying is that it reduces the peak load on the city. And therefore, if there is more work from home, more people can actually stay in the same city, because only a fraction of those people are actually using the transport services of a city at any given point in time. And that's an interesting thought to think about in terms of how you conceptualize the whole idea of work from home. And the second is much more mundane, but very important. And I would like Madhu, since she has such rich experience in Southeast Asia, and now, of course, Mark's also been working in Indonesia. Lei Lei has been working lots of across Asia. Indian markets are vibrant, but not particularly organized, especially urban, fresh produce kinds of markets. And this is true whether it's Crawford, whether it's Oila thing, whether it's Bangalore. And in Chennai, of course, it's and apart from the Wuhan wet market where all of this is apparently supposed to have started or not, Chennai, as one of the major clusters, was driven by interactions at one of their major markets. In my travels across Southeast Asia, one of the things that has impressed me, even in the smaller cities, has been in some sense the relatively organized nature of these. It is a public facility and it's managed as such as part of the broader public infrastructure. Is that a fair understanding? And how exactly would you characterize that, Madhu? Or, but at this point in time, please feel free to jump in and speak across each other, because the format of this, and for those of you who are watching, if you can switch to the gallery view, if you have not already done so, we would prefer this to be a conversation among the 6 panelists. So please feel free to make remarks to each other and going forward. But let me begin by asking you, Madhu, is my impression of markets in Southeast Asia accurate, or just a tourist's anecdotal sort of being impressed by something which he does not see in India?
I'm sorry, I didn't get your question, Partha. What exactly are you trying to
the question
understand?
Kala was talking about one of the ways of controlling this particular virus is better management of fresh produce markets, whether it is wet markets in terms of meat and fish, or whether it's fresh vegetable markets. And when you travel around Southeast Asia, one of the things you do see, and China and Vietnam and so on, is are these markets which are relatively well managed, whether they're in smaller towns, whether than large cities. These are structured public places with, it's managed as public infrastructure rather than as informal sort of places of exchange, which they are in much more the case in India. Right? So in India, it's like an overgrown small village market that sort of has evolved into something in this particular stage. So is that impression, given your much wider experience in these areas, accurate? Are markets actually much better managed in these kinds of places? And I say that because the market as is not thought of, and Dr. Ramachandran and OP will sort of correct me, they're not, even though in our urban programs in India, we do have one of the earliest interventions was to set up these kinds of market structures. They've not been the kind of markets that Kala is referring to, or the fresh produce markets that you see in these areas. Those areas have been typically outside the pale of being thought of as major infrastructure of a city. Is that something that is that you see as when you talk to your interlocutors in these smaller towns? Do they see the market as a major part of their economic activity?
So I can give you 2 examples based on my experience, what I'm seeing in Philippines right now, and based on my previous experience in Vietnam. So interesting enough, in Philippines, what I see, the trend is pretty much what's happening in India, right? Because the markets are not that well managed. They're still part of public infrastructure, but they're not well managed. And what's happening is that we recently did an analysis of urban hotspots where we mapped out population density and looking at minimum floor area ratio that you would need to move to follow social distancing. And we mapped that to the areas near the wet markets. And it was a very interesting analysis. It was a geospatial analysis, which immediately pointed out that your biggest hotspots in urban areas are actually going to be the wet markets. Why? Because people do have to procure food. And a lot of people, especially poor people, cannot afford buying food in supermarkets. So their first entry actually happens to be in wet markets. And that's where it's very hard to exercise social distancing. So from a health management perspective, it becomes crucially important to actually start looking at what's happening in the wet markets, because that's where the biggest congregation of people happens. And it's very hard to observe social distancing. So that's what we saw in Philippines. And now we're in discussion with the governments to see how they can start looking at some of these hotspots areas and start to have better management and movement of people in these jurisdictions, besides looking at the sanitary and other health facilities around these markets. And then I speak to my experience in Vietnam. In Vietnam, it was very interesting. Because Vietnam has been hit by several zoonotic diseases, especially swine flu and other diseases, the public authorities there took proactive action to start cleaning up and sanitizing public markets. So what came out of that was a more sanitized and a more enforced approach to start looking at public markets. And this is something that they asked World Bank for financing, and we had a very, very successful project in Vietnam, which precisely went ahead and financed and upgraded the wet markets. And if you look at the disease spread incidence in countries like Vietnam, they didn't see much in the wet markets because they were already ready for it based on their past experience from swine flu and through SARS and other cases. So I think it's pretty much dependent upon a country's experience. I can guarantee you 20 years from now, the wet markets will look very different from what they look today in messy countries like in India and Philippines, because I think with every episode of public health emergency kicks in responses. And that's what I see today in Vietnam. After having gone through several diseases, they are now far more vigilant, both in the way they bring produce to the market, but also in their farms, because they also do a lot of surveillance and other testing at the farm. So that's something that I think we can learn from some of these countries, is how to prepare ourselves. We can't do much now, but at least moving forward, there is a lot of potential to upgrade some of these public facilities that you're talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else would like to jump into that conversation? There's or any other issues that you might want to respond to across or you want to say something?
If I can button up.
Although I thought that the two markets, one in Thailand and second in the Green Hills in the Philippines, are reasonably well organized even now. No? That's what my recollection is of my visits to these markets in the Philippines, in the country right now, and Thailand. The Thailand market, they say, they claim that the wet market is one of the largest in Southeast Asia. And that certainly looks very large, very, very large in Bangkok itself. That was my impression, but that was 2, 3, 4 years ago. And I wouldn't know what the present situation is.
Partha, I had a couple of points.
Okay, please get in.
No, I think this point that Kala raised about management of markets is very important and critical. But then the way I would look at it is, it's not just a question of mismanaging markets. I think a lot of other services are getting mismanaged. So it's really part of that larger inadequate management of cities that is coming into play. But there are some examples. I think a number of cities do have public facilities where farmers could come and sell their produce. You know, I've seen in Chandigarh, for example, you have one market which is somewhere near Sector 28 or something like that, which I have gone to, where you have a public facility. But as happens with many public facilities, you've created a certain capacity at a certain point of time. But as and when demand goes up, that capacity, that capacity doesn't go up. So supply and demand is a mismatch. But if you look at a little outside Chandigarh, say Mohali or Panchkula, they have farmers markets which have been set up, very good space, and to my mind, very well managed. So you do have some examples like this. I think these need to get replicated. I think policies do exist, but then as you have poor management in many other services, the same thing is playing up. Yeah. I just wanted to mention this.
Partha, I wanted to jump in here. Is everybody able to hear me?
Yes, don't worry.
Yes, okay, I've unmuted, okay. When we were living in the US, I mean, Wednesdays, actually in Ohio, in Lancaster, Ohio, we used to have these farmers markets. So I think that is a great idea to have it on weekdays, maybe Monday afternoons when people are really busy, so that you can keep the social distancing and keep the density really low in those markets. And I think that is one way of better managing this thing at a municipal level. And personally, I mean, I've been to several Chinese cities and they're all equally, I should say, badly managed. I mean, Xi'an, Wuhan, Chongqing, Beijing, Jinan, Shanghai. I mean, I've been to markets, I've walked through markets, the smelly markets in many of these cities, and they are all equally, I mean, bad. I mean, whatever day of the week or whatever hour of the day. So, but I think in Indian cities, I mean, I think this weekday thing might work. I don't know, Monday morning or Wednesday morning or something like that, if we can manage that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes,
Partha, yes.
Okay. May jump in. So I mean, I find it fascinating how like the conversation has gone quite quickly from kind of the macro, sort of the level of cities, to kind of the very local in terms of like markets, the very micro. I think that sort of, makes me think of just the importance of kind of neighborhood level, spatial granular planning within cities, and the ability to be able to do that, type of planning, and have the capacity to do that type of planning can kind of make a dramatic difference in terms of like the overall management of cities. And also being able to have community participation in that sort of local level neighborhood spatially granular planning, that you need to sort of deal with these kind of local issues. As Madhu said, we've had a lot of work on hotspots in the work. And so, it's kind of identifying those particular points within cities and our potential hotspots in terms of disease transmission. And then, being able to sort of tailor planning solutions to be able to kind of rethink those spaces for the future potentially. So I'll pass back there.
Thank you. Yes, Professor Mathur just gone from landscape mode to portrait mode. So you might want to turn your device in some sense. There are three issues that have come up, broad issues that I would like to flag at this point in time. And we can park them from now, or if any of you would like to make immediate comments, you could do so. One relates largely to this whole issue of urban form in terms of not so much more than urban form, the form of urbanization that would take place. What will the system of cities be like? Will we have large metro-centric kind of development, or will the development that is going to come up going to be much more about network cities, or actually even, as some of the audience have been pointing out, looking at much more decentralized, smaller, rural kinds of frameworks going forward? How much of this excess urbanization, this pressure and capacity that OP spoke about, is due to the lack of basic infrastructure in the smaller towns and villages? And if you actually had a more spatially neutral investment in infrastructure, would you see the same kinds of metrocentricity that you currently see? And one of the members, I think it was Romy Khosla who asked as to whether or not this particular kind of urbanization that we're now looking at is essentially a relic of a larger colonial frame. If you look at our major cities, for example, Delhi, Mumbai, Chennai, Kolkata, these are all in some sense the products of a colonial past. So that's one large set of questions that one sort of has been raised. Another question relates to the issue that came up, which relates to the kind and the markets discussion. I think illustrates that very well, is the extent to which these issues then become how local do you need governance to be like? And in Solly, for example, is asking whether the kinds of interventions that we're thinking about, do they essentially reinforce the centralizing tendencies of governance? Or can we think of ways in which we can have a much more local mode of governance? And whether, and Mark, and even Madhu and Lei, I mean, when Professor Dr. Ramachandran spoke about polling booths, I was reminded of street committees in China. And of course, Indonesia is famous, especially Surabaya is famous for its kampungs. And the question is, and you have had these various barangays in Philippines. So are these effective modes of governance? And how can we blend them in the same way that OP spoke about a networked range of cities? Can we think of these kinds of localized governance sort of agglomerating into some kind of a mosaic of different levels of government going forward? The third relates to the nature of urban transport and the role that will play going forward, and the role of the car in whether the kinds of concerns that have been raised about density is going to lead to sprawl, or will it lead to sort of more enhanced density, as Kala was speaking about? And that tension is a third issue that seems to have cropped up in the questions going forward. So all of these three things we can park for now, but if anyone, if you want to jump in and make a comment, you could do so, and then we can move on to the second session, which is largely about the issue about what does all this mean for the way in which federal funds are provided to Indian cities, and does that architecture somehow need to change going forward? Let me first begin by asking whether any of you would like to sort of respond to these three questions at this point in time, of course, or take it up later.
Partho, I can't resist coming in on the transport bit.
Sure.
But yes, I mean, I think Kala's point is absolutely right. I think there is no place for the car, frankly, in today's situation. That is something that we really need to, see what we should do as far as that. Fortunately, as I see, the younger generation is providing hope, in the sense they don't feel that ownership of a car is important as a status symbol or something like that. They prefer to use an Ola or an Uber. What they believe is ownership of a ride is good enough. You don't need to own a car. I think I see a lot of hope in that, and I hope that with that, we'll start seeing a bit of a decline in personal motor vehicle ownership. That is the trend globally. A lot of people are talking about mobility as a service, which means you don't need a transport vehicle to be able to meet your mobility needs, but it's available as a service. I hope that will progress. Let me leave it at that.
Partho, can I intervene quickly on the size distribution of cities?
Sure.
Actually, you have raised a very, very fundamental issue, I think, which is of interest not only to India cities, but most Asian cities, I'm afraid, because some Indian states like Karnataka and now Telangana, they are characterized by very steep urban primacy, which means that the population of the biggest city in the state is like several times that of the second biggest city, which actually violates all kinds of ZIPS law, right? What it predicts. So what I want to say is, if we can view this pandemic as a shock, it depends on the extent of hysteresis effect this shock will have on the future distribution of cities. As of now, it seems that post-pandemic, all the migrants going away back to their homes, and they come back only when there is a job for them on offer, right? So it seems that honey, we are shrinking the large cities and we are kind of expanding the small towns and villages. However, this actually depends on the depth of the shock. Hysteresis is a term borrowed from physics, which is applied to local labor markets, which says that if you apply a temporary magnetic field to a non-magnetic field, it becomes permanently magnetic, right? So one-time shock might permanently change the characteristics of the city size distribution. So I really think that at this point of time, we are reading too much into the pandemic, and I don't think that it is significant enough to change our city size distribution, because I've done several Google searches on the duration of the pandemic. Maybe it might be there for 2 years, which is probably short to medium term. And I really don't see that changing our distribution of cities, either in India or other countries. I don't know.
The way I hear the questions that are coming in, Kala, is not so much as to whether the pandemic itself will lead to the change. But what I hear people asking is, this is making us ask the question as to whether or not what should be the optimal city-side structure, and whether or not our current structure is perhaps a little too over-concentrated.
Right.
That is the question that is sort of being asked, and that is, I think, what Lei Lei also sort of referred to. Lei Lei, would you like to say something at this stage before we move to the next section?
Yeah, I think, I can jump in. Yeah, Professor Mathur, you want to say something?
No, you go ahead. You go ahead. Lei Lei,
Okay.
go.
Yeah, I mentioned, I think this size of the city is probably depending on the resource allocation by the government. Because if you have, like you look at Manila, Manila is the biggest city in the Philippines. It's much bigger in the second city in Manila, in the Philippines. Why? Because also so much resources are concentrated in Manila. And then the opportunities it could provide, then naturally people would congregate to this place. Even they suffer every day by 2 to 4 hours. Yeah, some of my colleagues, I was living in Manila 2 years ago before I moved to Delhi. And even they suffer 4 hours of commuting time, but still they stay in Manila. Why? Because otherwise, if you don't stay in Manila, you don't have that opportunities. So these resource allocation issues can be a function of the government, yeah, because they put a lot of investments, and then it can be also the choice of the private sector, because private sector responds to the incentives. So look at India. I think you also mentioned the second topic we are going to discuss about the funding from the central government. And this central government order schemes also represents the government's the willingness to allocate resources.
Partha, can I come in now?
Yes, please.
Part of the size distribution, you would recall, it was one of the research pastimes of the early 70s. Almost every country was working on how big, how can we, what is the optimal size? Exactly that question. And the question was posed, if I recall right, as a U-shaped curve, where the cost of delivering services were extremely high in small cities, that declined up to a point, then they began to rise. The empirical work of the 60s and 70s that was done showed that yes, unit costs were very high for small cities. They declined up to a point, but then there was no increase or there was no rise of the cost curve or the size. There was no diseconomies was noticed as for the size. The debate continued until the end of 70s. And then precisely the point I think one of us raised, that managing the city is far more easier than trying to change the city size. And after that, I've really not seen any serious work having been done on city size distribution. I think the last book was by Alonso on economics of city size, and which raised the vital question, how big is big enough and how big is really big? That's my answer.
Thank you. let's now move to the next session. And let me begin by asking Dr. Ramachandran to answer one of the questions that we have been sort of grappling with at this point in time. I see Lei Lei has dropped off, and hopefully he'll be joining us back soon. Is based on, you mentioned the vocal for local as one which, of course, our Prime Minister has recently used that phrase. And if you were to think about using that as the guiding principle for urban governance in India, would the nature of urban schemes, and it was during roughly around your time in 2005 or so, when the first sort of JNNRM was the first major serious financial intervention by the federal government into the urban space. Would the design of these interventions, would the nature of these interventions now need to be different if we were to think about vocal for local as the guiding principle of our urban governance going forward?
I didn't get the last part of your point, Partha. Would it?
So I was asking, sir, whether the idea of the vocal for local,
No, that I got, yeah.
Applies that to the design of urban schemes that we have. How would that change? And do you foresee that happening? Should that happen? And if I can ask you to put on a more predictive hat, knowing your colleagues and former colleagues in the services, will that happen?
Well, thank you. Thank you. I mean, I was trying to take advantage of this inclination to make a local more vocal. So probably, I mean, it could mean very many things. So probably we should try to bank on that and try to advocate why local governments should be a little bit more stronger. As I said in the beginning, I don't say total empowerment, a mayor in charge of the city. I mean, Mumbai, we still don't know who is the mayor, but Mumbai, we know the problems they are facing and the pandemic situation, but we don't see the leadership of the mayor, of course, due to very many reasons. Whereas Greater London, still the mayor's name is there, though the mayor has a grievance that it is the federal government which is running the show and local governments have not been given enough authority, at least to start with, but subsequently it is being given to them. But in a national crisis, I think it's bound to be somewhat centralized because we have to have a rapid approach and it has to be somewhat synchronized all over the country. So to come to this point, I mean, as I said, over these years, I've lost hope that an empowered mayor system will come into existence very soon in our country because of political factors. I mean, to be very frank, I don't think chief ministers or the members of parliament would want a powerful mayor in a city running the show. So can we have some sort of a via media approach? That's what I'm trying to advocate, that there is a little bit more power with the mayor, the standing committees and the council per se, where they can take decisions and move forward. If you look at the Mumbai governance today and compare it with, say, an Agra or a Hisar or so, one can see the difference because Mumbai, there are various things which still are done at the local body or local governance level. So can we have systems where this could be much, much more streamlined and it could be much, much more organized? If that takes me to the point you made about the missions and the schemes and programs, if you recall, since you referred to the urban mission, National Urban Mission launched in 2005-06, at that time, there was a little bit of a centralization in the sense that the 65 mission cities, the programs were sort of approved at the federal level so that it runs in a certain manner. Then all these problems came up, whether land is available, whether local resources are there and things like that. But smaller towns were more or less allowed to move forward. Now, as it changed, when the further missions were introduced, like Hriday and smart cities and the like, it was decided that there won't be so much of centralization. There will be some sort of local delegation in the sense that for a year, the plan would be agreed to and projects and programs would be decided at the state level. But even then, whether Hriday has been able to make a real impact, that is something which we have to see once we come to the close of the 5-year period, which is supposed to be 2020. Also, what is the interest which state governments are taking in finding the resources required for cities? Because all said and done, I think we all will have to admit that there is some semblance of activity as far as infrastructure improvement and the various other things is concerned, because there is something being driven by the federal government. Can we move out of that? That will take us to issues like what the Finance Commission looks at, whether a third list, a local bodies list is possible and things like that. That's a slightly detailed subject, but at least when the center is ready to provide some leadership with a certain partnership, are the states willing to take advantage? We can look at these two major programs which have been taken up, both Amrut and Smart Cities Mission. What has been the involvement? Many cities talked about citizen participation and finding resources locally. I don't think much resource generation has happened locally. It's basically what the central government has given and what the state governments have brought in, and little bit of a limited number of local bodies going in for municipal bonds and things like that. So that, you know, it's a difficult question. If there is capacity, then probably cities can do better. If there is no capacity, they'll still keep looking up to the state government and the central government. That is what has to change. So when I say some sort of empowerment, it is some capacity building about which I have talked about any number of times, and some sort of resource facilitation. I mean, in a country like UK, I think 30-40% or even a little more than that fund flow is from the federal government directly to the urban bodies. We don't still have a scenario like that. When we look at states also, I wish someone has done the studies consequent to these missions. What is the changes which has come about as far as resource allocation for urban programs is concerned? So whether it's a question of design, I'm not very sure whether the center will just part with funds and say that you do what you want, because center would like to see certain things happening in cities, especially which are contributing to the overall GDP, employment generation, tax revenue, all these factors which we all know very well. So some sort of intervention would be there, but there is always scope for dialogue and framing what needs to be taken up. You had earlier raised this point about whether these missions will continue to be relevant. As I said, 2020 or 2021, these missions, the mission periods come to an end. I'm not very sure, given the type of situation now, whether the center will have enough resources to part with to be given for cities to take up more programs. I have my own doubts. Same with state governments, because there is going to be a resource crunch. What cities used to get from the states, I don't think they're likely to get that also. Ultimately, what we will end up is, we will have very bad roads. We will have programs which are unfinished. We will talk about all these new initiatives, but much of that would not happen because local bodies will continue to complain that we don't have the resource generation capacity. So there are going to be difficult times, as I see. But when we talk about missions and programs, I think some of the fundamental objectives are very, very relevant. Housing for all, if we talked about that, and if it was driven by the federal government, at least I think, if not all, 80%, 90% people may end up having some sort of dwelling, especially those who are confined to the slums and such areas. So that is one positive. Similarly, Amrut talked about water connection for every household and sewage connection for every household. If that happens or something close to that happens, that is a fundamental success we would have achieved as far as our cities are concerned. So these fundamental basics on which we should have focused long back, we are trying to do that now. Houses, water connection, a certain assured hours of availability of water and things like that. And moving on to transport, certain beginnings were made. One really has to see what has happened further to that with the state's initiative. Bus rapid transit system started. JNNURM gave large number of city buses, but now they are slowly becoming outdated. So there are issues like that. So it's a question of where will the cities find their resources from? And for that, though OP talked about a sort of cluster arrangement, I would draw attention to the combined authorities arrangement which UK has, where they realized that cities, if they don't come together and compete, they are going to lose out. So again, this is a point I've been advocating, but statutorily it has to be provided for. Otherwise, each local body thinks about its limits and its own money-making propositions and things like that. One working with the other is something which is not envisaged in our scheme of things. So either legislatively or it'll have to be through statutory provision only. Cities should be encouraged to work together where there are certain commonalities of advantages, whether it is agglomeration, whether it is like waste management, things like that, and even water management, transport. These are all areas where a group of cities, 5, 6, 7, or which are adjoining cities, can work together and try to derive advantage. But for that, unless we have a statutory arrangement, this is not going to work. That will take me to Professor Om Mathur's point about the national capital region, which was envisaged as a larger, bigger city. Now, what went wrong is states have to participate in this process. It is only a legislation which exists through which NCR came into existence, but Delhi has its own requirements. The adjoining areas, the states keep thinking that why should I invest more money in those areas just to benefit Delhi? So we haven't been able to get out of this. And this NCR concept has in a way been challenged at this point in time, because you cannot get out of Delhi and enter Noida, or you cannot enter Delhi from Gurgaon. So we did not put in position a structure whereby the NCR concept can work. But as we move in the future, as I've been saying earlier also, from Delhi to Agra is going to be a continuum of urban living, urban activities. But we will have one geographical government here in Delhi, which thinks in a particular way. We have another state like UP, which has another way of looking at things. So we still have to think in terms of mechanisms whereby these areas can work together, and a citizen, whether he's living in Noida or beyond, or Delhi or Gurgaon, can think in terms of moving freely. That restriction has come about, and that is one lesson which people have learned, that though one talked about seamless connectivity and things like that, metro stopped, so one couldn't move. One had to take the road route. So these are also issues which have come up. I know I'm taking a little bit extra time, but just to refer to, I think one of the questions which has been raised is, how do we empower ward councillors? Again, as I said, it was envisaged ward committees, and below that area sabhas. These two should be made functional as far as the local body governance is concerned. The state governments have to take the lead to do this. Hyderabad made a provision for that, but it didn't go much beyond. Karnataka made a provision, but for Bengaluru, they couldn't really make it work. Maharashtra provided for that, but after that, nothing much happened as far as empowering these ward level committees and the level below that area sabha is concerned. So we have to have these structures in position if you have to have some sort of change as far as local governance is concerned. If the area sabha concept was relevant, or if the area unit was functional, there would have been adequate information about the 1,000 plus people living in that area, who requires what, and what is the medical tie-up possible, what is the market tie-up possible, and a commonality of existence would have been ensured if that had come about. But today, we are in a situation where we don't even know who our neighbor is. So that area unit, and strengthening that and having that data system at that level would have helped the local body also to manage things much better. There is no urban policy. That's one of the questions. I don't know whether a single urban policy is possible, but urbanization strategy is something which states can think of. Karnataka started thinking about it at one stage. Rajasthan started thinking about it, but it could not be taken forward because of whole lot of factors which have to be brought into consideration while taking a decision at the state level. The center talked in terms of the Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor area, new towns coming up. One keeps hearing about Dhulara and places like that, but that would be a world apart from what it is. And one lesson we'll have to learn is, even Chandigarh, which is a well-planned city, Chandigarh's periphery is filled with slums now. So we have failed to take note of the requirement of housing and people who come into the city, who have to work in the city. So if these failures continue, these problems are going to continue. One point about the wet markets, I think we all read about it. In Chennai, Coimbatore market, that's where the problem started again, because people started going to the market and then the problem surfaced once again. But what is talked about as either a marketing yard or a mandi, the master plans normally provide for this. I recall in Delhi, there are 4 different corners where it is provided for. Delhi itself, those who are familiar with Delhi would know, behind the Hyatt Hotel, there is a market which comes into existence every evening with lights and things like that, and all the essentials which one need becomes available. So there are places like this. When we impose restrictions, there are problems. So as I said in the beginning, going back to retail, having a sort of local arrangement for most of these things, that is really going to make much of a difference. And I think that's where probably that's the direction we should be able to take. Impact on mobility, as I mentioned, there could be some impact on the mobility issues which we face if some of these developments which have happened, remaining at home, working from home, virtual classes, conferences and things like that really continue to flourish, then probably there could be some relief as far as mobility is concerned. I know I've spoken a little bit too much. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Ramachandran. There's three things that I would like to just quickly point out, and I'm conscious of the fact that this is, I had no idea so much time had gone past. But the issue of networks of municipalities, you've had Association of Municipalities in Europe for a while, you've had the special districts in the US as ways of organizing structures, and even in around Mumbai, you have had the STEM project, which has had this water supply project with the Mira Bhayandar and the Thane Municipal Corporation and so on. And that's one issue that could possibly come out of the structure. The two other things which perhaps other panelists could pick up, one relates to the fact that, as Dr. Ramachandran mentioned, the money from the center would, or even from the states now seem they're all fiscally stressed. Will this open up an avenue for, will they let the cities get revenue handles? For example, will cities be able to charge a fuel tax on consumption in their own areas to be able to, let's say, raise resources for public transport? Is that something that is at all feasible? What are people elsewhere around the world thinking of? And secondly, the issue of land. We have all spoken of slums, Mumbai, space, density on one hand, and then on the other hand, there is this whole issue of land-based financing as a way of generating funds for cities, which then provokes people, because this is a market which can be controlled, which leads them to restrict the supply of land so that the price of land is high and you can generate more resources by selling the land that is under your control. How does one deal with this tension, especially as the stresses on our fisc are going to be difficult going forward? Mark, can I turn to you now? You've had, of course, a time to reflect on those reports that earlier that you wrote about India. Has any of that changed going forward? And what would be your advice for the way in which urban support for India should be designed now, based on what you're seeing happening elsewhere and what has happened in India since?
Oh, thank you very much, Partha. I mean, I must admit, it's been several years since I've worked in detail in India, and so I don't have any sorts of magic answers in that sense. But reflecting, back on the work that we did several years ago, I think we did sort of identify three fundamental deficits almost at the local government level. First of all, a kind of empowerment deficit that I think has been talked about, the absence of kind of empowered local officials who are kind of well known to everyone in many ways. Associated with that, second deficit of accountability, both kind of accountability upwards within the system, as well as downwards to kind of the people on the ground in many ways in terms of participatory urban plan, for instance. And finally, the big issue of the resource deficit. And I mean, obviously these are like very intractable in many ways, political economy problems, which are difficult to overcome. I guess, the last few years I've been working on Indonesia much more thoroughly, and Indonesia did go through a big bang decentralization reforms, 1999, 2000, with those big bank decentralization reforms, we did see, you know, a movement. They still have the big centralized schemes in Indonesia, but they also have many more resources kind of delegated now to the districts. And at the same time, you know, those districts are much more empowered. In many cases, you know, individuals have been able to make a difference in terms of, for example, the mayor of Surabaya has done like a kind of exceptional job in terms of the city. I mean, yeah, how to sort of within the structure of the Indian political economy to kind of, you know, bring about sort of that more sort of local empowerment and incentives to be able to also raise resources locally. I mean, you know, those are really difficult questions to be able to tackle. I mean, I find it interesting, this like idea that maybe the fiscal space has become so stretched in some sense that, okay, the government at central level sort of allows for more autonomy at the local level in terms of revenue raising. You know, maybe sort of the current problems sort of necessitate intervention in some ways in local government to be able to deal with some of these issues. And that could be like a positive kind of outcome. So let me leave it there. I'm also very conscious of the time, and yeah, I want to give time for others to speak as well.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, we will extend the webinar a little. I had no idea that this would be such a fascinating conversation. I'd completely lost touch of time. My own computer is set to New Zealand time for some reason, and I was quite structured in the place. Can I now turn to Lei Lei? And you've been working now in India, and you've been working also with the on fiscal issues of the government. Do you see this as an opportunity or a problem for Indian cities? Will their funding from the center be cut short? Or do you think that they might be able to get the ability to raise more local resources going forward?
Thank you, Partha. Yeah, I believe actually this pandemic provides a huge opportunity. And if you look back to the Chinese reform, why they started reform in 1978? One major reason was because the central government at that time was almost bankrupt. It couldn't provide funding to the local government. It couldn't provide adequate funding to almost everything. So this is why they let the farmers to do the job by themselves. So this is the so-called household responsibility system, because basically the households in the rural area, you have to be responsible for your own living, and then the government wouldn't restrict you. And they also started the reform for so-called city responsibility scheme system. Basically let the city to go. Why? Because they couldn't give cities money to fund all these services. Then this is set off, all the market-oriented reform. Why? Because suddenly the cities didn't subject to all these regulations, plannings. Then all those small cities became so free, and then they started all the economic, experiments. So this is why actually the urbanization in modern China started in the late 70s, early 80s in China, in those delta regions, around the regions around the Shanghai and the regions around the Guangzhou. Because that's the start of the China's urbanization as well as the China's industrialization. All those cities basically started all those, they wouldn't call it private firm at that time, they were called so-called township and the village enterprises. All this history, actually, people forgot that history. The success, economic success of China was largely from that era, 1980s and the 1990s. So I would say this pandemics constrained the central government of the India for the fiscal conditions, and probably they would let a lot of things to go. And if you don't have the resources to fund so many so-called centrally sponsored schemes, then you let those schemes to go. then you allocate resources to the states and the local governments, and give them the authorities, revenue authorities, then probably to match their expenditure obligations, then also to match their political obligations. So probably this pandemic may create a huge fiscal crisis, but this would be a huge opportunity for India to go forward to reform. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Kala, do you agree with Lei Lei's assessment? This looked like manthan, first out of which comes poison, and then eventually will come nectar. Is that the mechanism that is that an appropriate analogy for this particular time?
Okay, Partho, I think in some ways, India and China stories, the federal tier system and the intergovernmental system of grants are very, very similar. And now I think that with this crisis and the severe fiscal crunch that the central government is in, I'm afraid that our poor cities have to fend for themselves with additional roles and responsibilities. So what I think will happen, Partho, is that the cities have to actually, I mean, you propose the idea of a fuel tax. I don't know what is the constitutional provision for city governments to charge some surcharge on this fuel that consumers buy. But what I think is cities have to identify the sources that are buoyant as and when the city economy grows. That is, I mean, no surprise, no rocket science. It is our old friend, the property tax. So the property tax we have found is that it is very progressive in some of our Indian cities, as Mathur would testify to that. Delhi has a unit area system. Bangalore has this self-assessment system. I think Kolkata is also going to shortly move, or it has already moved to this system. So that is one, such that the property registered reflects the actual market value of the transaction, and that happens only when the city economy bounces back from all this crisis. One. The second thing that the cities should, I think, effectively do to overcome this fiscal crisis in the crunch is that identify the non-paying properties, identify also the under-assessed properties, unassessed properties. And I think, as I understand it, most cities in the country have completed the GIS mapping of their properties. So this should not be really difficult at all. And in some research we have done with funding from the government of Karnataka, we found that, I mean, this just the simple thing of doing this unassessed properties, non-paying properties, and even making some of our own government properties to pay a tax will yield substantial amounts in terms of property tax, even if we don't really use the market value of the property as the basis for our assessment. That is point number two. And the third thing I wanted to say, Partho, is in response to what you said about land-based financing of cities. That's a great idea. Actually, we did a study for the 13th Finance Commission, Government of India, in which we looked at land as an asset, which urban development authorities have a lot of control over, and the municipal authorities don't have so much of control over. But we found the most shocking thing, which is that cities don't have a record of what land assets they have and what belongs to the city, what belongs to the urban development authority, what belongs to railways, what belongs to Ministry of Defense, what belongs to public sector enterprises, and so forth. So if you don't even have a record of how much land you have as inventory, how on earth are you going to really monetize this? And we found that cities like Jaipur, for example, in Rajasthan, they were actually very, very successful in leasing their land and actually transferring a significant proportion of that revenues to the city government in order to meet their day-to-day O&M, operations and maintenance expenditure. However, in China, cities, I think Lei Lei might comment on this later, I don't know, but this kind of land leasing has led to a lot of speculation and soaring of housing prices in China cities. But now in the post pandemic situation, I'm glad, again, as I said earlier, this is nature's way of balancing what we need and what the city's economy needs, is that the depressed housing and real estate market now should enable the government, both the federal, state, and the local governments to provide more affordable housing to all our migrants. And I think the time could not be more ripe for the government with its limited fiscal resources to embark upon this journey. Thank you, Partha.
Thank you. That is relatively optimistic. Madhu, do you sort of share that optimism? And do you have any ideas about where else cities could raise money from based on what you see across Southeast Asia?
Well, I think this whole pandemic has really questioned the role of national government intervention into local spaces, right? So what we're seeing, at least here in Philippines, is that the national government, because it's cash strapped now at the national level, is basically requiring local governments to take far more responsibility for what they call as devolved functions, which earlier was being provided by national government. So I think in some ways that accountability measure that they're putting to their local governments is really going to make some of these local governments think a little bit differently the way they do infrastructure and other financing. Earlier, it was primarily mostly pork and barrel projects that most of the local governments used to do, but now with the constrained fiscal space, they will have to further prioritize and also identify projects that really matter to them and deliver them fast, given the election cycle that we see here. But in terms of revenue sources, I fully agree with Kala. Look, land management can be an asset for cities, but it can also, and if it's not done well, it's also a lost opportunity for cities. And this is where I see at least cities in India and a lot of countries really need to step up. And I think what's emerging right now is that the whole advancement in technology and digitization actually provides a really good opportunity for cities to start looking at their public land management, because it's not just the overall land management and what you can recover out of property taxes, but also what can you do with the assets that you own. I remember when I used to work in Cairo, one of the vast tracts of land in the middle of the city used to be owned by the army, and the city could not do much. And when we did a public land management study in Cairo, one of the key things that we realized was that the public sector was sitting on very prime land, which they could easily redevelop and use it towards areas like affordable housing. And that's something that I think if a city can develop a good asset management system and start to take a look at what assets it has, I think that for me would be a huge win-win for cities. The other areas which are usually the common pinch points are like the where you commonly collect taxes are business taxes and other things. But those in this current age, given the broader economic decline, they're not going to generate much. The third area, which again, once the situation normalizes, is also to start charging for service delivery. I know that basic services like water, sanitation are not charged that much. And that's another area that I'm not talking about cost recovery, but at least if you can start covering for O&M costs, that itself would be a huge revenue boost for municipalities. So there are a lot of avenues and opportunities, but I think it all depends upon how much autonomy and accountability is provided to local governments. And if that's not given, then whatever you try bringing into the local space is not going to work. So that letting go and allowing local governments to have some performance metrics and to bring in some seal of local good governance would in some ways really allow local governments to do better. And I think that's what is really needed in countries like India and other places. Thank you.
Sure. So finally, OP, performance metric-based financing for local governments. Do you see any chance of that happening in India, though it might actually be, as Madhu says, what is needed?
It's a chicken and egg situation that you have here. On the one side, we've seen the JNNURM, to some extent, Smart Cities Mission, pumping in Government of India money as a carrot for doing some of the right things. But as Dr. Ramachandran listed out, a number of cases where the money was given, certain things were started, but then didn't carry on, is perhaps because they were started only because they wanted to draw the money. Once the money went, then those things got forgotten. I think the right thing to do is what Madhu and Kala have mentioned. I think not collecting your property taxes which are due to you. No one else can do that. You have to do that. And a number of other sources that Madhu also mentioned about where you could raise money. I think all of them need to be done. The question is, what is the motivation or the compulsion for the city level to do it? And I think Madhu answered that by saying that if you don't empower them, which means you don't make them accountable for it, why will they do it? Today, in a city, if something doesn't happen right, no one looks to the municipal commissioner or the mayor. The mayor doesn't matter. Everyone looks to the chief minister or the state government. Now, this is where that whole devolution of power from the central, or from the state government to the city level is the big question mark. And I, for one, believe that if we just keep talking about the ideal, we won't really get there because there are a lot of political compulsions against this. Can we, in the Indian context, find something which is a via media? And one example that I've been trying to give is, can we not think of some locally elected guy who may be a minister in the state government, but say you are the guardian minister for that city, and then make him accountable for everything that happens in the city, so that the next time when the elections happen, this guy is thought of as a kind of mayor for that city, and he has not delivered. I think otherwise, just talking on about the ideal situation of the mayors must be empowered. Honestly, I don't see that happening because no state level MLA will want to give up his powers. But can we use someone at the state level to become accountable for a city and sort of deliver on that? Maybe an interim kind of thing that could start. The other small point I wanted to mention is that, what is happening with a lot of these national programs is that the money is coming with a whole lot of conditions of what should be done. I think it was a good way to start. I mean, I think the JNNURM was a great way of sort of creating emphasis for urban. But should we now not start thinking of more of the original thinking of what is needed in a city, emerge from the city level or even the state level? And let there be a pot of money with very few boundaries on what it can use for, but let that creativity come from the local levels. To my mind, what that needs is a huge effort at capacity building, something which we have really not focused on, but which I think is the most important thing to take forward. But I would say that, yes, what your conscience, what Madhu says is right. Whether it will happen in the near future, I have my doubts. But there are via media that can be tried out. Let me leave it at that.
Thank you. That's a fascinating sort of tour of the various issues that come across. Let me first begin by asking the other panelists whether you would like to respond to anything that any of the co-panelists spoke about. Kala looks as if she wants to ask somebody something, so I'll let her go first, please.
Thank you. Thank you for this, Partha. OP Agarwal said that a city should have a minister in charge so that they can deliver this and it will be reflected in next year's election. He's absolutely right. Bangalore was actually one of the first in the country to do this, and it had a district, Bangalore Urban District in charge minister. But you know what? He miserably failed. So with the result that the city continues to crumble with all the infrastructure needs. I mean, that is a great idea in theory, in principle, but it doesn't always happen in practice. So I don't know if any other cities in the country have this precedent at all. I think Bangalore is probably the only one which has a district in charge minister, and a failure despite that.
I would not take one example to say it's a failure. I think the idea needs to be sold a little more. I know that in Maharashtra, some of the cities have the concept of a guardian minister. I mean, a lot also depends on how influential that minister is in the state cabinet. You know, if he's a weakling in the state government, no one will listen to him.
Possible, yeah.
So I would say that let's not give it up just because in one case it didn't work.
Possible.
I think it's something that has to come in somewhere.
Possible.
Dr. Ramachandran, would you like to comment on that?
You're muted, sir.
No, we have lost you, Dr. Ramachandran.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, these are all the different ways of trying to find an answer, which we have been doing for years. OP is right. Karnataka has this minister in charge concept. Maharashtra has this. In some other states, districts are assigned to ministers. But since they won't be accountable in that sense, unless it is modified and it is, I always go for this statutory provision because that's the only thing in which one can get hold of someone. Otherwise, any informal arrangements, that does not really work, and one always gets away by blaming the other. But pending that, I would still argue for, I look at people like Professor Mathur and Partha to look at, you remember the Megacities governance study which was undertaken earlier. Moving away from that, is there some, because we know politically this is not going to happen, I'm sure. Not in my lifetime, I don't know, in the next generation lifetime also, the local bodies are not going to get fully empowered. But something less than that, at least the subjects for which they are supposed to be responsible, for them they are held responsible, and a finance commission mechanism or a devolution of funds, certain amount of devolution is guaranteed, and that becomes available to them, and they have to manage with that. And that combined with all these concepts of livability index, service level benchmarks, accounting to the public, can we bring in a culture? This may not happen all across the country one fine day, but maybe we have to start with certain number of local bodies in some states, or in each state certain number, and try to show to the people that this is possible. And with more of participation of the people starting from the area level, a different type of governance system can come about. In the process, not challenging the authority of the members of the Legislative Assembly, of members of Parliament, or even the ministers, so to say. So is that possible? Let me also cite one more example. In Kerala, mostly what happens is when one particular combination is power in the state, it's the other combination which is in power in local bodies. So all through those 5 years or close to 5 years, nothing much happens there. So this politics has really confused the way we are having local governance. So we have to have some thinking as to how best we can try to manage the situation without hurting, I have to say this, without hurting the larger interests. And even this, the point about land-based management and all, we have talked about it for quite a number of years, and there has been certain amount of efforts. I won't agree that there is no record available at all about land. It is generally known, but most of it is, as I say, in the case of Mumbai, Port Trust owns good amount of land. But the Port Trust in its scheme of things also has to find resources for its expansion and things like that. So these are days when there is so much of competition. Railways have been asked to monetize their land and find resources. During my time, I had advocated that whichever is the public sector land of the federal government, we should try to identify that and see whether housing is possible. But that is easier said than done. So each entity would want to live with this land and resource and raise additional resources. If they didn't do it 10 years back, if they're doing it today, they find they're getting more resources. The Railway Station Development Authority, that has capitalized on the railways land, and they are generating resources out of that to develop railway stations. So in the federal scheme of things, especially if the governments are of two different colors, I don't see that happening much. But to be very frank, with very small cities, small towns, they don't own much land. And in very many systems, everywhere land is not vested in the local authority. So there are development authorities who acquire land and try to develop that. There are certain government lands, and in the north, probably, you know, there are lands like I suppose it's more or less getting away now, enemy property and Waqf property and things like that. There are components like that. So in the revenue records, it would be available. It's not that it's not, but the fact is, most of these city bodies or town bodies do not own so much of land that it can be made a big source of income. So it's a question of how best devolution can take place and how local bodies can. I don't think raising the property tax and all is a way out, because especially in the difficult situation, people won't want to pay more property tax now. Bangalore is one example. During the early days of the urban renewal mission, there was improvement. They relied on technology, there was improvement. But if my understanding is correct, it has started coming down again. So in our scheme of things, it's a wave. Something improves, then again we go back to the old scenario, and then there has to be another mission or another activity to bring about improvements. I'll stop at this. Thank you.
That sounds like the pandemic story that we're talking about. Professor Mathur, I was just about to turn to you to see whether the panelists had any closing remarks to make, and then for you to close the webinar, because we're like running now roughly about half an hour over time.
Oh dear. Not really a closing remark, but let me, I think it happened during Dr. Ramachandran's time that Manishankar Iyer used to press very hard for the Ministry of Local Government. And I remember having seen at least 3 or 4 letters coming from Manishankar Iyer that let this ministry become Ministry of Local Government and not really urban development. And you know, the ways had to be found to tell him that, look, Ministry of Urban Development does not deal only with local government, but it also deals with many, many other subjects. And that was the only way in which the proposal that was coming, and he also wanted the state governments to also set up the ministries or the departments of local government. That did not go very far. Just on one issue, which is what we have been studying very closely with the Finance Commission. What we are seeing really is that the municipal fiscal space is shrinking year after year. Earlier, it used to be only the centrally sponsored schemes, but now it is centrally sponsored schemes, Finance Commission grants, and performance grants. Between the 3 of them, they take away roughly about 30 to 35% of the total municipal expenditure, which are all laid out with where to be spent, how much to be spent, all of that is laid out. Now, this is the only one. In the beginning, we thought it was a very good thing the central government money was being funneled into local services, because the local government was not able to do that. State finance commissions were not really that active. But now we are beginning to feel that this acquisition of municipal fiscal space by the higher tiers of government, and you know, I don't know what is this principle of subsidiarity with which the 74th constitutional amendment began. Where does it leave that 74th constitutional amendment? I think that debate is becoming increasingly pessimistic on the municipal fiscal front. And much as Dr. Ramachandran sort of makes a plea for the area sabhas and the board sabhas, and we've seen the gradual diminution of these bodies as you know, wherever these were set up, there was an area sabhas act was passed. Many of the state government passed, as Dr. Ramachandran said, but we just did not see the light. These did not really see the light of the day. I am sorry, Partha, that I'm ending it with kind of a sort of pessimistic note, but that is some kind of a reality that we have to, and we are not finding any light there. On Mark remembers that the whole chapters were being devoted on empowering local government in the leveraging report. Huge amount of work that was done by Paul Smoke and others for that report, and remarkable case was made out for empowering local government with independent financing and so forth. touching has really happened in Nepal. Our recent work on property tax in Delhi shows how inadequate Delhi is now from the time when there was, before the trifurcation of the municipal corporation and before the coming in of the unit area system that used to yield much more revenue for local governments than what the new system does for local government, for the property taxation in Delhi. Thank you very much, Partha. But just a word of thanks to all the panelists. As Partha said, we are half an hour behind schedule or ahead of schedule. I don't know whether we spent more time, but it was very fascinating discussion. That's the we had hoped that it would be with this excellent that we had. Thank you all very much, and very nice meeting all of you. Even though this is only a screen meeting, but very, very valuable. Thanks very much, and Partha, all the best.
Thank you so much. And if any of the panelists would like to make any closing remarks, otherwise, please flag so. Lei Lei, I see you are unmuted if you want to say something, or Mark,
Okay,
Madhu,
I just
and
want
Dr.
to say,
Ramachandran are all mute for the moment. Yes.
I just want to say this crisis is really unprecedented crisis. I think India probably would like to try something new, to try something new mind, new ways of doing things, and a new kind of federalism. Although we emphasize a lot of cooperative federalism, probably we need some sort of competitive federalism. Let cities and states to compete with each other. Then let resources go to them. Let them do things whatever way they want to do. I stop here.
Thank you. Thank you. There's a separate conversation that I think Solly and Kala can have offline, because I can see his question there on the screen about whether, which I think Dr. Ramachandran referred to, as to whether or not the property records are in a way in which we can actually charge taxes. But given that it's now 6 o'clock in India and pretty late further down in Manila and in Singapore, I'm acutely conscious of the fact that it's 8:30 there. So thank you very much for joining us. The proceedings of this entire webinar will be online. This is extremely well organized by INHAF. So the entire proceedings will be there, along with the other 29 webinars that Kirti Bhai spoke about at the beginning. And I'm sure this is going to be a rich resource for us to think through about how we want to work with our cities going forward. Thank you again for making the time for joining us. Ramachandran, Madhu, Mark, and Kala, and Lei Lei, and OP had to leave just before we closed. Kirti Bhai and INHAF, this has been a real pleasure. Professor Mathur, as usual, you did all the work, and all I had to do was to make sure that the questions keep coming. So thank you so much for organizing this, and grateful again. Thank you.
Thank you. Partha, I have a quick question. Once we leave the meeting, will we be able to access the question and answers in the chats?
Yes, I believe our colleagues at INHAF, which is why we were asking people to put it in the Q&A box.
Okay.
We believe our colleagues at INHAF will be archiving all of that.
Okay.
And it will be accessible to all participants and others on the website.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Partha. Thank you, Professor Mathur.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye. Bye, all of you.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care, guys.
Bye.
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 Yeah.
Bye. Stay safe.